Welcome to the CNBC Africa special with Nigeria's Minister of Power, Housing and Works, Babatunde Fashola. In the next half hour, he talks about the achievements and challenges in these three key sectors. Now, I started by asking him what the state of the power sector was when he first became power minister. Take a look.
We had a power situation that clearly hadn't satisfied the aspirations and needs of Nigerians. We had a clear understanding how critical power was and is to driving our economy. We had power programs and projects that were uncompleted. We had power projects that were held up by court disputes. Aba was held up by a court dispute. Zungeru was held up by a court dispute. The Azura power project had been delayed by politics. Government didn't give the requisite approval. So those were transmission projects were caught up with compensation issues, right-of-way issues, court cases. So we needed to just really solve all of those, itemize them painstakingly, understand what was necessary, and with the leadership that the president provided and the vice president, and the cooperation from the ministries and departments concerned, because power itself is not a standalone. I put it this way: we are end users often of feedstock from gas, for example, feedstock from water, from mineral water resources, feedstock from coal, for example, from solid minerals, and gas from petroleum. So we need that continuing collaboration. Because finance and budget also where we need procurement. So those were it was a state of real, I call it running repairs, really trying to put things together. But as I've said consistently, it's less of a technical problem and more of man-made problems. And perhaps solving the court disputes, there is no technicality about it. It was human beings that created the court dispute. There was an agreement not to sell the ring fence about power plant made several years ago whenever privatization was going to happen. The previous government sold it. So the person had a contract that had been breached, went to court. But instead of completing the power plant, they were fighting in court. So with the vice president providing leadership, the ministry doing the daily meetings, we solved it. They're out of court. The next step is how to finance the compensation claims that have been agreed in the settlement because of the dollar differentials. That's where we are now. Zungeru were compensation claims, they were not paid, lawyers' fees were not paid, so they went to injunct the project account, so the project couldn't be funded. Again, with government at federal level, working on the governor of Niger State, we solved it. They're out of court, construction is going on back in Zungeru. Azura couldn't take place because government didn't give the necessary guarantees. Mr. President approved those guarantees. Azura is now working, I've been to the site. So these are some of the issues that just needed people to knuckle down, pay attention to detail.
Okay, now let's talk about your ministry, the power ministry's three-phased approach to getting the power sector on a path of growth. You've identified incremental power, which will lead to stable power, which should eventually lead to uninterrupted power. Now, specifically, take us through the specific steps you're taking to achieve incremental power, especially with the Mambila plant.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say about that is that I've tried to make the power industry understandable to the man on the street, so that as much as possible, he can understand what role he or she has to play, because government won't play all of the roles. There are interconnecting roles between government as an institution and individuals. That was the first thing we tried to do. Second thing was to go away from the rhetoric about X megawatt, Y megawatt. Really and truly, no matter what the megawatts are, when people have electricity, they will know that they have electricity. And if they don't have, no matter the multiples of megawatt, really, if there are problems at the local last mile ends, they know that they don't have electricity. So the megawatt really means very little to them. They may become symbolic as we communicate milestones, but they mean really nothing. So that was part of the thing, and we said, look, what's the problem? The problem is that Nigeria does not have enough power. Our peak power generation in all of our history as a nation was 5,074 megawatt achieved on the 2nd of February this year. Now, if that's all we've done since 1950, and we are growing in multiples in our population, clearly there is an insufficiency of power. What do you do when you do not have enough of what you need? Go and get more. And that is why incremental power as a first step. Very simple, basic. So it cumulates to megawatts. And so every time we add 1 kilowatt, 1 megawatt, 5 megawatt, 3 megawatt, we are getting incremental power. So how do we get the power? We're going to look at all of the possible sources of getting energy that Nigeria is privileged to tap. Gas is one for quick, large size, ramp up power plants. Coal is another one, which we haven't used for a long time. Water is another one, the hydropower plants, and we have Kainji, Jeba, and Shiroro as a big hydro dams. But we have many small hydro plants, Chalawa hydropower, Ikere Gorge hydropower, and there's so many like that, about 40-something, which we are also trying to bring to procurement. We've completed the business plan on 8, and we're trying to see if we can get that on. That will help our rural electrification projects, because those dams are in rural areas. Then there is, of course, solar. We have a lot of sunlight, and we can use them when the sunlight is efficient and optimum during the day, and also in the parts of the country where the irradiation levels are at their most prolific, so that efficiency is delivered. So that has led us to deliver an energy mix, which was presented at the National Council on Power, and we are targeting to increase the almost zero content of renewable energy in our energy mix to about 30% by 2030. So that will give us more hydro, more solar, more wind. There's a 10 megawatt wind power in Kaduna that we're trying to complete. Specifically to Mambila. Mambila is a project that was conceived in 1982. It was conceived to be our largest single hydro and possibly, in fact, thermal power plant in size. Its concept was about 3,000 plus megawatt. But since 1982, beyond initial environmental impact assessments, geographical mapping of the area, a planned resettlement exercise of the extent of people that were, the land on which the project is going to be built hasn't been acquired even as I speak. But previous governments had awarded contracts on a site where there was no acquisition. So the president is providing leadership here. Of course, in the process, 3 different contractors have become involved. They have gone to court, come back from court, and they are now fighting. There seems to be an unclear pathway. But one of the first things the president has done was to convene a meeting, and this was on the back of his visit to China and getting the support of his Chinese counterpart that they will support the delivery of this project, to say, look, these 3 contractors, all Chinese, must now work together. For the first time, we now have a joint venture agreement signed by all those 3 Chinese companies, apportioning the work to be done, signed by them, supervised by their home government. And so the first major step of dispute resolution towards delivering Mambila has been overcome. The next step is for the state government to acquire the land. The governor of Taraba has expressed support for this project, but it's his obligation under the Land Use Act to acquire the land, and then we can begin the process of resettlement, compensation, and so on before construction can begin, so that there will be no disputes, there will be no court cases that will stop construction.
You have said that Mambila can deliver 3,000 megawatts.
That was the conceived design concept. A lot of things have changed since 1982. And so we're also looking at what are the realities today in terms of water supply there.
Okay, so all the reports that we've heard that it's nearing completion and
it has not started.
So all of those are not true. It
hasn't started. I can tell you that authoritatively.
Okay, about gas, you mentioned gas. We know that we continue to have challenges with gas, especially on the vandalism side. Is the government powerless against these vandals?
We are not powerless, as you have seen from initiatives first, in terms of nothing has been taken off the table. I have said first that no individual or groups of people can be angry forever. So there will come a time when the anger will go away. I mean, we've seen the IRA crisis, and peace has come. But we need that peace to come quickly. What are the options? The options are dialogue and law enforcement, because no matter how angry anybody is, vandalizing public assets is also a crime.
You've identified anger. How do we know it's anger? Because sometimes I hear, or most times you hear that it's just purely sabotage. You know, there are rumors of there are different theories as to why they've
I don't know what the answers are. As I said, as a ministry of power, really, my responsibility is to supervise the production of power, generation, transmission, and distribution. Now, so I'm not too different from a generator owner at home. My power plants are not too different. They're just bigger. So I need fuel from the pump to power my generator. Somebody else supplies that fuel. That's the Ministry of Petroleum. And they're doing everything that they can. The Honorable Minister of State, the President, the head of the NNPC, and also the security forces. Now, if I can't get gas because of a security problem, it becomes the responsibility of the security agency. And you've seen the Chief of Army Staff and the security team also responding. Each person, each group have their own set responsibilities. If the military need power in their barracks, they look to me also to supply it. And that's how government departments are interdependent on one another.
Okay, let's talk about coal or the energy mix. Now, I've spoken to a couple of energy analysts, and they say that they're a little concerned about so much we talk about the energy mix, solar, hydro, and the rest that we're going to use to support gas to plant. So what you've talked about 30%, are we going to go higher than that 30%? And are
30% renewable was what I said.
Okay.
30% renewable, and that's a large mix, because most of the big nations who are championing clean energy today, very few, if any of them, has exceeded 10%. They are still doing a lot, except for those who have nuclear power. Many of them are still dependent on gas and coal. The UK, the US, South Africa's coal mix is very, very high. And these are things you can check and validate yourself. But the effort, the real challenge is to continue to reduce the power, the impure power, if you like, or the unclean power as you go on. But if you ask a nation like South Africa to shut down all of its coal plants, that's their biggest source of energy. It's like asking them to stop existing. Some nations don't have coal, they have water, like Congo. They do a lot of energy from the Inga Dam. And they're going, I think, to Inga Phase 3 and selling power across. Some nations have more gas than coal, some have more coal than gas, some have more water than both, and some nations don't have the kind of sunlight we have here. So we're really privileged to begin to seriously walk our talk, and that's why I'm here. We've talked enough, and just start walking the talk. So a few weeks ago, we signed solar power agreements to do 1.2 gigawatt. We started our first, we commissioned our first solar plant to drive water supply. And so the energy mix journey has started. And all of this connect to the very simple roadmap of incremental power. Just get power anywhere. And I don't think people will really complain too much. We are mindful, of course, of getting clean energy as much as possible, but we must survive first before we clean up our energy, in fact. Okay,
now we've often heard that transmission remains the weak link in our power chain. And now that Manitoba is out of the picture now, what is the government going to do with the transmission company of Nigeria?
The truth is that the transmission capacity is well over 5,000 megawatts as we speak today. Now, I told you earlier that the highest amount of power we have ever generated is 5,074. So clearly we can carry what we are producing today. We are not vulnerable as to be unable to transmit that. Now, if you understand that the transmission system is the transport system moving the power from where it is produced to the distribution system where it is sent to your house and to my house, that's the transporter. Now, if you were doing a transport business and you had a bus that carried 10 people and you had to carry 10 children for me, can I really complain that your bus is inadequate? So we should stop these generalizations. Now, what would I persuade you to buy an extra bus if I still have only 10 passengers and you have one bus that was carrying 10 passengers? What would you do with the idle capacity? Who will pay for it? Well, that is not to say that we are not planning an expansion, because we have idle power that is stranded because there is no gas. So as we are trying to solve the gas issues, we are also simultaneously planning the expansion of the transmission system to run in synchronism with what is available, because idle capacity is also cost. The capacity charges for what you build and you don't use, because they are built with bank loans. So we're planning to go up to 20,000 megawatt over a time frame consistent with how our power increases, so that we don't have idle capacity in the value chain. So these are the simple problems getting the departments to now meet. When is gas coming? So we have expansion work going on in the eastern axis of the country, from Ikot-Ekpene through to Alaoji onto Enugu, and from there we can boost power all the way to Makurdi. Those are the places I told you we had local issues, one in Itu, the second one in Abia State, and we are solving them. We've completed a few transmission projects. We're working in Kanu, Kaduna. Walalambe is one I can readily recall off my head. Kumboso is another one I can readily recall off my head. The Alagmo transmission station in Lagos is one I can also recall off my head. And quite a few others. We finished the one in Okada in Edo State, and there are more that have been awarded this year. The Gurara transmission to take power from Gurara Hydro Dam into Kaduna is nearing completion. It was a site I visited. So work is going on.
Let's talk about tariffs. I know that you've spoken strongly about tariffs. As we know, tariffs are the actual cost to produce power. Now we know that we had that 45% increase that was subsequently overturned by a federal high judge. Now some might argue that that may send wrong signals to investors about how binding contracts between government and an investor or a group of investors are treated in Nigeria. And it didn't appear to be a strong response from the government. What do you say to that?
What stronger response could you get from government if I, as the head of the ministry, had expressed support for the position taken by NAC, if I, as the head of the ministry, had also appealed for understanding, and I think the way to perhaps deal with the problem is that, as we were explaining tariffs, now we have relatively more stable power today. I'm getting messages from people, they haven't bought diesel for like 6 weeks, they haven't used up their, and so perhaps this is the time for them also to reflect that the more reliable energy that we get and the more they pay, the cheaper it will become in the long run. Unfortunately, power is a commodity you can't store. Once it's produced, it must be used and paid for. Somehow, the way the value system for payment has been designed does not allow for gaps in the system. Now, we've also asked the discos to try and do business with a conscience. Yola Disco, I remember, for a particular month, I think it was all July when the power was really bad, asked his customers not to pay unless they had bills that they were owing before. And that, for me, is an example of business with a conscience, because that puts you in a very, very strong moral position to come back later and say, look, the price has gone up. And I will sit down and ask myself, when the service was not good, I didn't pay. And I think going forward, that should be. The point to make also is that, again, cliches, 45% increase, that is not true in point of fact. The generalizations, because the tariffs differ from disco to disco by margins of kobbos and a few naira here and there. So it wasn't a flat 45% tariff increase.
Let's move on to housing now. Before you became minister, there was a housing policy of 2012. Are you building on that, or is there a new housing policy?
There is no new housing policy. What does the policy say? It's a policy that seeks to achieve affordable housing for Nigeria. That's a broad statement of the policy. Where is the program? There's no program towards that. So the program, the thing that was done, or let me modify that, the program was using PPPs. All the PPP agreements that were signed in the last 10 years were supposed to produce 21,000 houses. They have delivered only 2,000. If that was a program, clearly it's different. So policy is one thing, it's a broad framework. The policy of this country was to provide reliable energy for the people, right? So what's the program? We just talked about the bolts and nuts. That's the program. How do we get there? I'm traveling from Lagos to Accra. Do I need a visa? Am I flying? Am I driving? Am I going by boat? Those are the programs that take you to Accra. Where am I staying? So what are we doing? We're trying to see, and we have found out why some of the housing programs of the past, from Jakonde at state level, particularly to Shagari at national level, hasn't been continued. Why is it that we can only lament about what they did and we haven't done more of it if it was so good? What's so esoteric about building a house that we haven't been able to do every day? And we found that there were design issues. Some parts of the country didn't accept certain designs, and certain designs was not conducive for their cultural way of life and also for their climatic diversities. So we've evolved new designs that we think responds to this. How do we build more? Because it's one thing to start. Those are illustrious predecessors started, but did we continue? We didn't continue. How do we make sure that when we leave, this won't be another story lost in 30 years? So standardize the designs so that everybody does the same thing, so that you can produce them on an industrial basis. So doors, same sizes, windows, same sizes, locks, switches, tiles. So, and that is how you automate production, so that small and medium sized industries can now go on a sustainable basis into wood, cabinet, furniture, ironmongery, fittings, paint, tiles, knowing that there's a market for it. When the designs change every day, there's no sustainability in production. And those are the things we have resolved now. We have 6 designs. We standardize all our fittings. We have decided that we are going to use only made in Nigeria fittings so that we can keep the economy in this country instead of importing doors, tires, and all of those fittings. So that, again, that is the way that we programmatically use our ministry to deliver on the policy of government to diversify the economy.
Let's move on to works now. We don't have much time left. I know that you've talked about the fact that 1.7 trillion naira is actually needed for all to complete projects, road projects in the country, and of course we know that revenues are lean at this point.
No. Again, I'm always very careful what I say. Those were the projects that had been awarded.
Okay.
They had awarded 206 roads before we came. Total contract price was about 2.2 trillion. Amounts that had been paid over the years was about 700 billion. So about 1.5 trillion, at 1.5 trillion thereabouts, so 2.2 was what was needed to finish those projects. And that was the reason why we said, let's start very simple. Let's try and finish those projects that have been awarded. Some of them had been awarded since 2002, some 2004, some 2014, some as recently as 2015, even in January last year. But the common story around them is that on the average, most of those construction companies haven't been paid over 3 years. Average of 3 years. So the seeds of the recession we are in today were sown 3 years ago. Whether people like to hear that or not really is of no serious moment. It is to understand how we got here. So that when government begins to now pay workers, construction workers who are old, and they start to fund projects as we are doing now, returning to construction sites, and Kano, Maiduguri, Sokoto, Kotsangora, Ilorin, Jeba, Enugu, Port Harcourt, the Zik Mausoleum, and so many other projects Oyo-Ogbomosho, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, they understand that the road to recovery is clear, because that was the road to recession, was owing them for 3 years. When government didn't pay its electricity workers in the completion of plants like Kaduna Power Plant, Katsina Power Plant, Dadinkowa Power Plant, and so on and so forth, and this administration starts to pay, it must become obvious to you that there is a road to this recovery, because you now know the cause. You took money out of the system, simple. You starved the system of fund. So the contractor at the construction site lays off his workers. The worker that is laid off can't feed his family, so he can't buy bread, he won't buy gari. So the gari and the bread seller don't get purchases. So the economy begins to contract. So the only way out, and the sensible way out, is to reverse what caused the problem. Start spending again.
That was Nigeria's Minister of Power, Housing and Works, Babatunde Fashola, talking about achievements and challenges in these 3 sectors. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esther Awuni.